Okay. If people are ready, So what I'm going to do is start with, can I get your attention? Thank you. Dom, you too, thanks. You can pick that argument up later. Just remember where you were. I want to go over the essay. Now, there's a couple of things, because people have asked me. If you take a look on the Moodle site, the York grade scale and Paul's 30/40 grading criteria is on there. It's also going to be in the Butler PowerPoint, and I'll go over it. And if you've got any specific questions, please ask as we go. And could you just confirm it's taping okay? Yeah, okay. So you know that it's due along with the film December 1 to 27. I'm trying to give you as much discretion in terms of your other work to do it as possible. So you can organize your time that way. So the concept paper 1 is 1,500 words, and I'm assuming at 250 words a page, that comes out to about 6 double-spaced pages. Make sure it's double-spaced. And you're going to pursue a concept that intrigues you derived from the course readings. And I listed some possibilities. You certainly don't have to do those, but just to give you ideas on the syllabus. So I listed things like time, labor, speed, what else? Emancipation, liberation, labor, value, gender, domination, almost anything we've talked about. There's about 20, I think it's about 20 listed there, but you can also do something different. Those were just ideas, so you get an idea of what I'm thinking of as a concept, or we're thinking of as a concept. Then, what you want to do is there's 12 readings for first term. You need to use 5 of them, and they're listed on the syllabus, of course, and they're listed here. So you need to use 5 of them in the essay. You can use some more than others. Here they're listed in alphabetical order, not the order we did them. And roughly, because I know what people are sort of interested in, is like what constitutes an A grade. And by an A grade, I mean within the range of 80 to, if you hit 90, it's an A plus, obviously, right? And it'll be marked out of 15%. So, but you can also figure it out of 100. So 5 of the 12 course readings must be used to discuss the chosen concept. What I expect the paper to have, and this is, I'm sorry if this is just really obvious, but I expect the paper to have the equivalent of an introduction, saying what the paper is going to address. So say you're going to address passion in 5 of the, and you can. You can also address the lack thereof. So if you want to address gender, okay, you definitely got it in Butler, you'll have it in Spivak, but you won't see it obviously in other theorists. So you can point out it's not in other theorists and how it might fit. Like that's perfectly legitimate and very interesting. So in the introduction, what I want you to do is indicate the concept you're using, and I also want you to indicate the readings you're using, and if it's absent in some of the readings, you know, what you intend to do with this. So the essay body consists of a 1 or 2 paragraph discussion for each of the 5 readings, addressing the key concept, or key aspects, sorry, that inform or relate to the chosen concept or the absence thereof. So you can either compare the readings as you go along, or you can summarize them. If they're summarized, then I would suggest a paragraph comparing and critically engaging them is needed prior to the conclusion, wherever you feel it fits in the essay. Now there should be a paragraph linking the essay and the 1-minute film video. So I would definitely have a paragraph linking and the 1 minute film. It should end with a conclusion, even if you think you're just stating the obvious, okay? Even if in your conclusion you just basically state what you did. Maybe it's different words than you said in the intro. It requires references, and you can use one of the 3 styles, and it requires a bibliography. So the reference style in the MLA, Chicago APA, the Scott Library, there's a Scott Library link to these styles, and that's both on here, but it's also on what's it called? The criteria, it's on the York grading scale and the criteria, right? So I put the link there too, so you can definitely find the link. I don't care which style you use, but I do care that it's consistent throughout. Sentences using correct punctuation and grammar are expected. I'll edit these. I won't take so much off for them, but make sure you don't give me the first draft. And then this is just a continuation of what is on the sheet that's there in terms of course, your grading scheme and course assumptions. And it seems that this is not fitting now. Which is kind of interesting. Let me pull it down a bit. Okay. So, in terms of, it's the screen, I see. This is fitting perfectly here. I'll put it somewhere. Yeah, okay. So, in terms of A+, so astute and or original observations, in addition to what I just went through on the previous page, it says above here, but it's on the previous page, because the person that's whispering stuff, oh, you're just explaining to Stephanie. Yeah, it's gonna be online, but thanks, Chris. So, in addition to what's on the previous page on the slide and what's on the grading scheme, astute and or original observations can potentially move the grade into an A+ range. A poorly written essay that sets out a concept and examines it in relation to the 5 readings will place the essay in the B+ to B range. Because it's important to me that you're using the concept. If it's pretty poorly written, I'm going to obviously edit it, and it'll probably be the mid-B range. But if you do the 5 readings, you set out the concept, it's interesting. An essay that uses only 3 sources will obviously be in the C or D range. So be careful. So then this is just the York scheme. So you know, A+ is excellent, A is like very good, and excuse me, also excellent. B+ it tells you like thorough knowledge of the concepts and turning techniques together with a fairly high degree of skill in the use of those concepts and satisfying the requirements. This is from the York schema itself. Good high level of knowledge of concepts and or techniques together with considerable skill in using them. C+ is competent. Obviously, you've got an acceptable level of knowledge, but it's not, you're not doing sort of anything kind of original. You're not doing anything kind of original. C is fairly competent. D+, and to tell you the truth, if you've done a D+, I'm just going to give it back. Okay? Because I mean, there's no, I mean, if for some reason your paper's a D+, a couple of things happen. I failed to communicate to you what was expected, which is quite possible. And I mean that sincerely, I'm not being sarcastic, because I'm not very good at sarcasm. Or you wrote it because you had to meet the deadline, and you wrote it and handed it immediately in. So I will send you an email. I will say, hey, like, I'm going to give you some more time on this, like, redo it, and come see me, and I'll tell you what's wrong with it, okay? Because, I mean, there's really no reason if you do the work you should ever get a D+. And to me, that just means, like, you know, we've all been there. You've done it 2 hours before you had to hand it in or something, right? So I mean, I'm giving this sliding deadline and stuff, but I want to make sure that like nobody walks out with a D+, because to me that would indicate that I'm not actually communicating what should be in the essay. So, you know, meet with me talking. Yes?
I was just wondering, I don't know if you mentioned it already, but like outside sources, do we use them?
You can, or it's up to you.
Does it?
So, I'm sorry?
We don't have to.
Well, it depends what you're going to do with them. If you're quoting a reference, like if you're taking somebody's quote, yes. Okay, if you're quoting a statistic, yes, because you want to know where that statistic's from. If you're quoting an idea or using an idea which you're playing the 5 readings against, yes. But it's not going to make it an A+ or an A whether you use, or a B+ whether you use outside sources or not. That's not what I'm looking for. I mean, sometimes people, again, and I'm trying to communicate this as clearly as possible, sometimes people will heavily use an outside source and go light on the course source, and so then you're stuck with saying, well, okay, this is a really good paper, but it's a B+ because you didn't use the course sources enough. Right, so it's a balance. But I mean, if you're using something from an outside source, do use it in the reference, because otherwise it's plagiarism, right? What's your first name?
Caroline.
Caroline. Okay, Chris, I got your name. I think I've got it.
So you said to address the video in the essay.
Yes.
In what respect?
I don't know. That's up to you. You want to say in the essay how the video is enhancing the concept and applies to the readings. That's a good question. But it's up to you how you do it, right? So, you know, you may drop quotes from the readings or whatever onto the essay. It may be like interpretive, there may be nothing there that's directly linked. However, I want you to link it, okay? And I also want to make sure that if you, by the way, in terms of references, if you use found footage, credit it. If you're using something out of the music video, they may take it down, because YouTube's pretty strict on that. Vimeo's less strict, so you could probably, and it's only a minute, right? Make sure that if you're doing found footage, that you alter it in some way. Otherwise, you're just like cutting a piece of footage out of something else. Yeah. Yeah.
Are we allowed to use this now?
Yes, sure. And you can, I mean, sure, like, I've got nothing on that. Yeah. It's a good question. I mean, you don't have to. Either way you want to do it is good. It's also if you, even though it's clear that, say, Marx, for example, is male and identifies as male, we'll talk about that in Butler. If your political position is that you refer to everyone as they, that's fine by me. Just indicate that and a little asterisk at the bottom. Okay, otherwise I'll think your grammar's off until I catch on. But yeah, that's fine. It's entirely your prerogative. Anything else on that? No? Is there like a major, like, air blowing in your...
Yeah, I was wondering if you could turn it off. It's not even warm. Like, it's just air.
Because I can see...
Like, I don't know.
I can see your... I'm sweating, so I can see your hair moving. And I'm like...
Oh, there's nothing.
Is it off?
No. I don't even know where this is. Oh, that's a lot there.
So it's not off if you take it down. It's still just coming through.
Yeah. Oh, there's a thing here, but like, I really don't want to die. Like,
Go for it, because otherwise you're going to be completely... Let me see. You're going to be completely dehydrated by the end of the class.
sacrifice yourself for this on the
No, it's
Oh,
okay.
there we go.
Is that off?
No. There we go.
It's ridiculous. Okay.
I think
That one's on. If you guys get, oh my God, that's so much better. Your hair is actually
that's pretty glorious though.
What's going on over there? The problem is it's really bad air. So, you know, it's like being on a plane. So, Hans, I went through the essays. It's on the, just a second. I think so. So, I want to get your attention. Are you Linda? What's your first name? Kelvin. Okay, Kelvin, so for the essays, I went through, it's on the Butler PowerPoint, what's expected for the essays, and it's also on the Moodle site under grading schema, so it'll be in the two places. If you've got any questions, just email me or make an appointment, okay? Thanks, Tommy. Hamza, same for you. And we can talk about it at any point if you want to ask me a question on the essays. Again, that's fine too. So I think you had your hand up.
I'm trying to find the first slide. You said it was on the Butler.
But it's not on the new, I haven't put the new Butler on yet.
Oh, I see.
So I will definitely put it on after class.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I was gonna say, yeah. So this is the new Butler. We added to the Butler because I wasn't doing Butler at this time last year, so that's the last year's slide. So what's your first name?
Michael.
Michael. Oh, that's okay, Michael. So Michael, for the essay, I've gone through what's required on the essay. It'll be on the Butler slide after class. And it's also on the Moodle site under your grade scale and grading criteria, okay?
Okay.
So you can find that there, Jordan, right? Okay, so Jordan, I'm going to repeat this again. So the essay requirements and are at the end of the Butler PowerPoint, which will go up after class. They're also on the course website, your grade scale, and Paul's 30-40 grading criteria. So, you said Kelvin, right? Yeah. So Kelvin, Hamza, Jordan, and who else just walked in? Michael. If you've got any questions, just email me, okay, or text me, or did.
I was on another question. Can you also use your personal opinion on an essay? Like, you can compare the authors and then see what you think?
Yeah, sure. As long as you set up the concept you're using, as long as you say what they say about it, you can definitely critique it. So I would call that rather than personal opinion critique. It's kind of personal opinion, right? Okay. Okay, so we're all good on this? Let's do Butler. We got 4 people presenting. So everybody's clear. Everybody is clear that we bumped, and I've changed it on the syllabus, and I've changed on the presentation schedule. These are on the Moodle site that we're doing Butler this week. Next week we're doing Spivak, and then we're doing Said. And it works out nice because there's the extra class at the end. So I'll do both Said and a wrap up. That should be fine. And the presentations follow that. And I tend to leave always an extra class each term in case something comes up. So, like the students' right, which is awesome. Okay, Judith Butler. Judith Butler is obviously still alive, 1956, because there's no end date. She's an American political philosopher. She does critical theory, gender, sexuality studies, 19th and 20th continental philosophy and political thought, social and political thought, philosophy and literature. She's pretty versatile. She's the Maxine Elliott Professor, Department of Comparative Literature and Program of Critical Theory at UC Berkeley. I always want to say UCLA, but it's UC Berkeley. So what you're reading today, or what you read for today or last week, is sort of the book that changed how gender was understood 1990, and it's sort of carried through. Would you like those in the jar? Yeah, thanks. And it's sort of carried through as changing how we understand gender. So for anybody that's in gender, feminist, women's studies, I'm sure you're quite familiar with this, and I'm sure if you've taken a course on anything in gender studies, you'll be familiar with this. It's influenced political philosophy, it's influenced third and fourth wave feminism, queer theory, literary theory, and bottom line, there's 2 points here. There's 2 points that most of us now take as a given. You may not, that's okay. We can talk about it, but what her 2 points are, so you don't have to take it as a given, okay? Like, I'm not suggesting that, but it's often taken as a given. When Butler wrote it in 1990, the first time I taught Gender Trouble, which I think was like 92 or something, it was like a really radical text. And it was a really heated debate about gender as a social construction. So the two main ideas that come out of here, and you're reading the first chapter, you're reading subject, sex, gender, desire. So the two main ideas is that gender is a social construct. So for anybody that has played with gender, for anybody that has cross-dressed, for anybody that has gone out in any way or taken a workshop on the so-called opposite or other genders, you'll be pretty quickly aware that the gender can be seen as a social construct. And I mean, Butler's talking about it, Butler's talking about it right down to how we move, and so is Foucault. How we move, it's not just how we dress, it's something that is somatic, it's embedded in the body. So that there are two really key points, and we'll build to these, that the gender is a social construction and that it's performative. And that we tend to perform gender, we tend to find something that works, and we tend to just repeat it because it's working, or we can change it at points. And it's sort of a repeated stylization of your presence in the world. So I mean, if you look around, people, you may not get up in the morning and say, hey, I'm performing gender, but if you look around, you can see that people are either consciously or unconsciously performing gender. I'm always performing gender. I've performed a number of different genders over time, which is kind of interesting, because people treat you differently when you present differently, right? So you guys are lucky you've got my sweetest one, and my easiest, so that's kind of interesting. But, so in that sense, I'm sure people know what I'm talking about. I mean, it's not like you have to consciously say, okay, I'm performing gender. I mean, media kind of does it for you. You just kind of slot yourself in unless you're thinking about it. Also, other things will do it for you. Background, location, beliefs, the religious beliefs of the society you're in, your own beliefs, these all go into performing gender. And there's kind of, in a sense, what you've got now is sort of multiple different performances of gender that one can draw from. Now, I mean, my political commitment was always to totally mess with any stabilized presentation of gender. So as a political commitment, as many other people have done and do too, because you want something different out there. Okay, because if you get something different out there, I always remember, you okay? No, no, no. Oh, did your computer fell off, right? Did your computer fall off?
No.
Good, because these things are terrible for computers because they were before computers.
Yeah, someone spilled coffee on me 2 weeks ago.
On your computer or on you?
On my pants.
Oh. Well,
Hot coffee.
now if that was me, I'd be sitting all over by myself now. Hot coffee, seriously, in class?
Yeah.
I'm sure they didn't mean to.
No, he's an idiot.
Hold on, now you can't call your classmates an idiot. It was like,
It was wobbly and he put hot coffee on it. It's like walking on the bus with hot coffee.
that's always troublesome. And then you stumble, yeah. Okay, so, and now it's nice and cool in here. Might even be too cool, but that's okay. At least your hair is not blowing out over. What was I going to say before? I can't remember. I got distracted on the hot coffee. Okay, well, gender is before. Oh no, I was going to say this. It's really interesting. So, a friend of mine, and this was quite a few years ago, was working in daycare, and she was she wore all leather, and she had a shaved head, and she was also, she's one of Toronto's top leather designers now. And she's super cool. She's a really nice person, and all of this. So she's working in daycare, and she was really committed. She's like, yes, I want little kids to get used to, she's working with 2 and 3-year-olds. She's like, I want little kids to get used to seeing a person like me so that when they get older, they won't be scared, they won't think anything of it. She's great with kids, so that kind of worked out. And I thought, oh, that's really interesting. That's a sort of real kind of political commitment to the job you're doing. So having said that, what I want to do before we start fully with Butler, is go through the 4 waves of feminism. And these are just rough categories, but just so everybody, it's like a refresher perhaps. And this is not to say that feminism didn't exist prior to the 19th and 20th century, nor to say that feminism didn't exist in practice in a lot of other countries and in writings and going back centuries. It may not have necessarily been called that. However, this is to say that in the North American and Western political thought, and sort of the first wave is dated 19th and 20th century. And if you haven't seen the film Harriet, I highly recommend it on Harriet Tubman. It's quite amazing, and you know she became one of the founding members of this. But what she also did was personally escort and help. I think she was responsible. She's a black woman. I think she was responsible. She's not alive now, but she lived to be like 95 or something. For taking like 70 or more people to freedom. Like she was like through the Underground Railway. So she was like, so, and the movie's like super good, and it's super feminist, you know, in a way that's not like you're sort of bourgeois North American feminism. It's like really hard-headed. So 19th and 20th century in the Western world, so we're looking at Europe and US here. Basically, first wave feminism, well, you've got like formal legal equality, which is really important. It's what became recognized as liberal feminism. You've got suffrage, the right of women to vote in elections, also really important. We take it for granted. We take formal legal equality for granted. We don't take substantive equality for granted because it's not there. And so, of course, the suffrage, the right of women to vote in elections, is connected, and that's how Harriet is one of the founders, and really influences, connected with the abolitionist anti-slavery movement in the US. Both movements aimed at social reformation and liberation from oppression. So officially beginning with the signing of the Declaration of Sentiments and Resolutions, 1848. At the Senate Falls Convention, the first ever women's rights convention. What this brought in was formal legal equality, suffrage, that is the right to women to vote, and abolitionism. Second wave feminism. So second wave feminism really kind of dates from the 70s, early 60s to mid 80s, very big through the 70s. What you get would be Marxist. You would get Marxist feminism, liberal feminism, radical feminism. You would also get like the marriage of Marxism and feminism. So you're probably quite familiar with this. It's equality across the board. Domestic equality, employment equality, and really important, one of the key players here were women's groups that were fighting for equal pay for equal work. Equal pay, and it's more important than that. That's a slip on my part. Equal pay for work of equal value. And you can say, well, we don't have this really. We've got the legal manifestation of it. So basically, second wave feminism, Marxist, socialist, liberal feminism, radical feminism, which also, fought amongst ourselves, affected the civil rights movement and the student rights movement. They were key players in that as well, as was the civil rights movement and the student movement key players in second wave feminism. Then what you get is what you're probably more familiar with, third wave feminism, which runs, depending on who you read, from the 1990s to 2005, 2008, right? So one of the keys on third wave feminism, and some of it's transitioned from second wave to third wave and published in third wave collections, particularly people that are working on sexuality, for example, or on racism. So third wave feminism fights injustices. What you've also got happening here, 2005, is the internet explodes, okay? So third wave feminism fights injustices. These are economic, racial, sexual inequalities, racism, child abuse, rape, domestic violence, homophobia, heterosexism, environmental degradation, classism, healthcare, and reproductive rights are all issues of third wave feminism. And third wave feminist assumption is really the assumption of independent female sexuality as a valid part of the public sphere. If you read their literature, that's one of the key points. And it also gives third wave feminism an in-your-face sexuality. And that is, it's present, it's center, and nobody's gonna back down on it. So front and center in third wave feminism is one's sexual ownership of one's body and respect for sexual diversity. And you can see the different signs there. I don't know what that one says, but it looks really interesting. Something about my clothes are not under
Louder.
louder than my voice. Awesome. Yeah, that's exactly what it says. Partly, so third wave feminism was very much influenced by Kimberly Crenshaw's concept of intersectionality. Now, this concept of intersectionality is an incredibly important concept. It could be a concept that you want to use to look at 5 of the readings with. So you would credit her with it, you'd write a little bit on that, and then you would take a look at where the readings actually display intersectionality or some degree of intersectionality. Or
So this is from the first book feminism, you said that?
second.
No, I was talking, my question, sorry.
Oh, okay, so this is actually, hold on, this is from third wave feminism. Intersectionality becomes a really important concept and practice in 1989. So if you go back to, 1990s, third wave feminism is really a foundation of intersectionality. I mean, it's not perfect, but it's one of the driving principles. Yes?
You said that women have formal legal equality but not substantive, so what
They fought for formal legal equality. And I would say, yes, they won. It's liberal, right? So yes, they won formal legal equality, but you could argue that women don't have substantive equality.
And what is that?
Substantive equality is, and you could argue that a number of people don't have substantive equality. That is that people have, equality not at the end, but from the beginning, would be the way I would define it. So yes, law schools are very conscious of admission of intersectional admission, for example. That there's, I think, 50% of women, 50% of law schools, women, female now, that kind of stuff. So that would be formal equality, that would overlap a bit with substantive equality. Where equality always breaks down in my read is that if it's only used as an end result, there's an awful lot of inequality at the beginning, right? And so substantive equality would be that which didn't allow for that.
So it's like, for example, substantive equality is, let's say you enter something and it's already equal for you instead of you having to fight for it to be equal.
That works, but even more than that. So that would be yeah, that could work. That's a good definition of that. I would say even more than that, although that's a good definition, is that substantively, go back to Rancière. Substantively, we start off from the same place. So in order to have actually what's called substantive equality, you would have to have, equality, much more equal income, for example. You'd have to have the sort of main provisions of life provided. You'd have to have free education. You'd have to, and more even than that, you'd have to have education that's not different in different school systems. That's all sort of substance, right? Yeah.
So you're talking about equality of outcome rather than equality of opportunity?
Well, equality.
That's what this is, that's what you're pointing at.
Well, equality of opportunity means you start off from the same place, okay?
Yeah.
So that is closer to substantive equality. Okay, equality of outcome is, yeah. Because one of the things we lack is equality of opportunity. And that, so first wave feminism wasn't able to address that. Second wave feminism hasn't addressed that. I mean, it's there, but it's not fully addressed or rectified. Intersectionality, when you get to third wave feminism, gets to it, right? Because the whole deal is like, there you are. I mean, if this is the person, if that's the self, if that's you, it's not just gender that goes into forming you, right? I mean, all of these, you know, sexuality, ability, age, social economic status, sex, race, ethnicity, all come together in terms of producing a, you know, a self, a constructed self. So intersectionality is a term that Kimberly Crenshaw, a legal scholar, developed, and it's a way of it's a framework for understanding the ways that the multiple aspects of our identities intersect, influence one another, and compound to create unique experiences. So the concepts used to describe the ways that societal privilege and oppression is complicated by the different parts of our identity that are marginalized or privileged in society. And I think that's that's her definition. I would say then that intersectionality is basically layers of oppression. It allows you to get to layers of oppression caused by gender, race, ethnicity, ability, class, age, sexual orientation, and the ... and general semantics, etc. You know, where you live. You know, if you live in Toronto, you've got more opportunities than living in, or, you know, living outside of where I grew up, Alexander, Manitoba, right? 250 people in this town. So, in that sense, you know, right, and now what you've got is sort of connection wherever you are globally if you have access to computers, which many people do and many people don't. So intersectionality becomes a really important, you know, I was going to say, if you happen to grow up in if you can get out of where you happen to grow up and there's no opportunities, you know, I remember as a kid planning how to get out of there. I was like, okay, this was go nowhere. I don't want to spend the rest of my life here, right? So then education became the vehicle. You know, and education is the vehicle for a lot of people who are not wealthy. The problem is education is also cut across class and wealth, right? But yeah. Okay, fourth wave. So 2008, so fourth wave really is strongly associated with online feminism. That is feminism that uses Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, Tumblr, and other forms of social media to discuss and activate gender equality and social justice. So the focus, like third wave, but maybe even more so, is on intersectionality. There's a focus on solidarity with other social justice movements, which is really important. And there's coalition politics and coming together around injustices so they can figures and then groups go their own way and then they reconfigure again if there's another social injustice. You know, so somebody's talk. Okay, no, it's what? I was how are they able to do that? So I mean, if you take a look, there's a number of coalition politics in Toronto around housing crisis, homeless crisis. You know, that becomes really important. So the focus is on intersectionality and solidarity with other social justice movements. What you get is a focus on inequality that manifests in street harassment, sexual harassment, workplace discrimination, body shaming, media images, online misogyny, attacks on public transport. They tend to rely on social media technology for communicating and online petitioning for organizing, and then mass mobilization as well around certain issues. So by 2018, the Women's March in the US, if you take a look at the mobilization of that, the focus was to register more women to vote, which goes back to a first wave feminist objective. So you can see how these build and overlap, and to elect women and progressive candidates to public office, which has happened. So then to go back to Butler, because Butler had an awful lot of influence Butler's theory had a really quite a bit of influence, starting with third wave feminism. She would have been a third wave feminist like myself in a way that transitioned then to fourth wave feminism. I mean, it would be a mistake to stay anywhere as sort of a diehard, I would say, a diehard second wave feminist, because it doesn't take enough into account, obviously. And fourth wave feminism is also very action-oriented, which is important. So to go to Butler, so what does she say? Well, what she's doing is a feminist genealogy of the category woman. So she's doing what she calls a feminist genealogy of the category of woman. That is on page 9 of the reading. And what that means, well, first of all, before I go to what that kind of means, let's go down to the second quote here, or second, it's not actually a quote, but it sets out what genealogy means, and then how it's an operative tool in post-structuralist thought, because she's a post-structuralist thinker, a postmodernist thinker. She would classify herself as a post-structuralist thinker. So genealogy, coming from Foucault, coming from Nietzsche, is a historical perspective, an investigative method, which is going to give you a critique of the present. So if you go back to what Foucault was doing in his work on Kant, and Kant's essay, I think it was our third reading, on emancipation and what Kant is saying, on the Enlightenment and emancipation, Foucault's doing a genealogy. It's a historical perspective and it's an investigative method which is going to offer a critique of the present. And I may have gone over this in that lecture, but I wanted to redo it if I did. It's what Foucault, drawing on Nietzsche, Genealogy of Morals, it's what Foucault, following Nietzsche, calls the construction of this a non-continuous history and of lineages of descent. One of the things that genealogy is going to do is foreground what's been omitted. It's going to take a look at those, the way Foucault is using it, those who have been excluded or marginalized by grand historical projects. So grand historical projects could be liberalism, they could be Marxism, they could be socialism, they could be feminism that sees all women as the same. Those are grand historical projects. So those who, it's going to foreground those who have been excluded or marginalized by the grand historical projects. So what Butler's doing, following Foucault, is a history of subjugated knowledges against the tyranny of the dominant discourses, or the globalizing discourses. So can you just turn that off. I'm not coming down on people. I know some people do for having earphones in. I actually believe you can listen to both something and a lecture at the same time, so I got nothing on that. It's just when it plays out loud. But it was the person behind you. I know. So no, I don't, and I also think, I really believe that is an aside, but I really believe prohibiting people from wearing earphones in class is really an invasion of their, like the way they learn and their own sort of phenomenology, I guess. So, and hey, I mean, some people learn with like 3 different things going on at the same time. And you can, I got nothing on it. There's a lot of things I really have nothing on. I'm just like, okay, it's, there's certain things, that's okay as long as you can hear me. I seriously got nothing on it. Okay.
I prefer listening to music while I study it.
Yeah, no, it's totally fine with me. If you start dancing around and stuff, or like you start singing out loud, then it's the same rules as the gym, right? People have their earphones on, they'll start singing on the machines, and they get told to keep quiet. So a genealogy then maps the interconnection among knowledge, power, and the body. And that's what Butler is doing. Now, what she's doing as a post-structuralist is the same as Foucault, and 1990 was a big moment for post-structuralism. So that is, she's critiquing these grand totalizing narratives that says, you know, what's causing exploitation really is labor. Butler's like, yes, you know, that's true, plus there's a whole bunch of other things. You can't reduce something to one concept or one component. So post-structuralism is going to critique all grand totalizing narratives, and the ones I always think of are liberalism, capitalism, Marxism, socialism, fascism. These are all grand totalizing narratives. And of course, socialism, communism, fascism, and liberalism can be totalitarian. So you've got that overlap there. Freudianism, you know, like there's anything that's got an ism on there tends to be a totalizing narrative. It also provides a critique of universal claims. Any claim that says this is the truth is a universal claim. So post-structuralism also critiques this claim, transcendental claims to truth, that this is a truth that goes through history, because it really is historical materialist in its approach. And then it really fits for Butler and for Foucault, which is why they're using it, and they're not just using it, they actually developed it, right? So the subject is an effect of the structure they're in, as we all know, the power relations we find ourselves in, and the knowledge practices. So how we understand something really, and we probably talked about this before, but I really find how one understands something has a lot to do with knowledge practices that they've encountered. So in my estimation, I think the more knowledge practices one can encounter, whether they agree with them or not, will give you a better, broader understanding of stuff. You know, if you just constantly talk to people that agree with you and use the same sort of knowledge practices you do, you're going to be left, you know, you're going to be left like within a narrow frame of them saying this is wrong. Not that you can't say I don't agree with something, but you know. Okay, so then this formation of the subject it takes place in a field of power, but then it's seen as foundational. Like, if we sort of say, okay, the way we are as a subject has to do with time and history, has to do with our geographical space, has to do with the political regime we live in, has to do with the education we get, has to do with family, religion. If it all goes there, the formation of a subject is taking place in these various power fields, or field of power, sure, but then it gets seen as foundational, which is a problem. Now Butler says, much like I was just saying, and this is her position on gender in a nutshell, that it's a cultural meaning. It has a cultural meaning. It's produced in time and location. So how your grandmother did gender, particularly if it was in a different location, it doesn't have to be, is very different, or your grandfather, is very different than how gender is understood now, right? How gender is produced now. So if you want to get a sense of like 1950s gender, and it's definitely an awesome movie, is The Irishman. Because they're really showing, so it's the one that Scorsese just did, is showing it too. They're really showing masculinity, and it's worth seeing. It's also worth seeing mapping what the female characters do. But they're showing masculinity at a particular point in time and location. So gender, of course, is historical. So if you wonder really why you're always fighting with either your grandmother or your parents about, like, they probably don't call it how you're doing gender, but about what you're going out in, where you're going, what you're doing, how you're dressing. How I was dressing is a good one for a moment. But that all has to do with time and location and assumptions around that, right? So gender is historical, it's social, it's in geographical space, and it's intersectional. It's totally intersectional. you know, you can't separate gender from class, you can't separate gender from religion, you can't separate gender from age, you can't separate it from race. It comes together, it's intersectional. Any attempt to make gender the primary ends up missing these other components. So it's not the primary, they're all intersectional and interactive. And of course, that we know that gender is not particularly coherent. This is on page 6. That Butler says gender is not always constituted coherently or consistently. That it's different in different historical contexts. It intersects with race, class, ethnic, sexual, and regional modalities of discursively constituted identities. So it intersects with, you know, like, you know, when you travel or if you go to a more conservative place, people will be looking at you because you're doing gender differently. So in that sense, it intersects with I mean, they may be looking at you in awe. Like, it's not necessarily negative, right? But that it intersects with racial, class, ethnic, sexual, and regional modalities that are constituted in that area, that they're discursively constituted, that is, they're constituted in discourse. So as a result, it becomes impossible to separate out gender from political and cultural intersections where they're produced and maintained. You know, and if you take a look at, you know, just dominant society we're in, pretty quickly people can, and everyone in the room will be able to say, okay, look, there's cultural and political ways that gender is produced and maintained. And so, you know, and then also you can say, well, particularly if you're transitioning, for example, York is a very good school to go to if you were doing work on political transitions in terms of body transitions. Whereas some other schools may not be as good at this, but it's really a key component of gender feminist women's studies. That's not to say it's perfect by any means. Okay. So gender for Butler then, and for post-structuralist feminists, and for third and fourth wave feminists, is really, and I don't know why this makes people angry. From the start I can never figure this out. It's simply for Butler, for post-structuralists, for third and fourth wave feminists, gender is simply cultural meanings that the sexed body assumes. You know, so the body is given different meanings in different discourses, and the meanings of the body in discourse shape the materiality of the body. So one of the grad students in my aesthetics and politics class is doing his paper on the aesthetics of like counter male dress, and there's like a whole bunch of YouTubes where there's a big discussion of how to present yourself as a counter, but like not as a hegemonic, but as like a well-dressed male in our society. Right? Like
those guys who do it are actually
right wing.
Okay, the thing is that when they're giving the YouTube advice, I've seen them show up on like randomly recommended. I'm looking at it, I'm like, they don't look like they're straight males. They look like they're homosexual males who are trying to be straight.
Or
they're going to extreme, like, oh, you
or
gotta do this to your eyebrows.
I have another take on that. That queer males actually have a really good fashion sense. So
they do, but they're claiming they're straight.
Well, it's hard to tell who's straight and who's not.
On those YouTube videos.
Yeah.
Well, I'm guessing the only views, that's the only way to get views.
And it could be that there's no sort of, well, there's coding in terms of straight and I guess there's certain straight dress that's really straight, but if you're actually breaking down what's considered, you know, cultural, then there'd be a real overlap between like, you know, gay and straight, probably. I haven't seen the videos, but I'm assuming that they're appealing to all sorts of different people. But my point more so, although that's interesting, is that there's ways of telling you can actually study how to do cultural meanings on the sex body, okay? That, I mean, if you're not happy enough just, you know, going along, having it sort of seep in from the society you're in, which it will, if you're not happy doing that, then you can actually have like endless YouTube wannabe superstars telling you how to do it for both males and females. And Instagram. So it's no coincidence that if you take a look at Instagram, for example, the poses always become the same, right? So the people who get lots of followers then do it, so that pose carries over. So then if you were to look at it from outside, you'd be like, wow, how come everybody looks like that? Like, why, you know, so I mean, it's just, so Butler, I mean, it's almost like Butler, what Butler is saying is now in its extreme, partly because it's meshed with dissemination, like fast dissemination. Yeah, Chris?
I could be misremembering the reading. She went on to make an extension where she said that not only is gender culturally based, but sex is
Absolutely.
also culturally based.
Absolutely, you're not misunderstanding at all. We're moving towards that.
Okay.
We're going through de Beauvoir to get there, actually, because that's what she does. But yes, absolutely. That what we take as an anatomical given is actually culturally reduced. And the corresponding, so the anatomically given, which then identifies you as like male or female, is taken as, she's saying that too is cultural. And gender develops, it's a production, and gender develops out of that.
Is it because of the association between sex and gender, or is it
Yes.
she's straight up saying, like, anatomically it doesn't matter?
Well, here's the weird thing, if you've read that, because I mean, the 90s was really big in people doing work on anatomical sex and its relation to gender, right? So, what they take as the male and female are, like, so this, you know, what they take is like male and female anatomical gender parts, we'll say, are at the sort of extremes. A lot of people, or a lot of us, fall in between. So there's a spectrum of 52 different, I think it's 52 somebody came up with, that there's 52 different manifestations of this. So there's no sort of, so what's taken as like this is female, this is male in terms of anatomical sex is at the two extremes of a continuum that moves all the way along. You know, so that's kind of interesting, because that has developed from Butler's work, right? So the body is given different meanings in different discourses, and the meaning. So I'm thinking there a lot more people than was previously recognized also were born intersex. Okay, so then what happens is your family's being forced to make a choice that you become whichever sex is perhaps most prevalent or the one that the family wants, right? So what you get now are people as, you know, keeping their intersex status. And so that would be somewhere in the middle of this continuum. So the body's given different meanings in different discourses, and the meanings of the body and discourse shape the materiality of the body. Clearly, right? So gender does not necessarily follow from anatomical sex, is where we've got to at that point. Now, in terms, I have to take my glasses. So Butler's genealogy intersects with these four influential French thinkers on the subject of gender, and they conflict with each other. So she develops her theory from four thinkers that kind of conflict. If you haven't looked at, so Simone de Beauvoir, Lucia Irigaray, Michel Foucault, and Monique Wittig, they all have different theories of gender. Now, if you haven't looked at de Beauvoir's Second Sex, I really recommend it. It's a really thick book. You don't have to read all of it, but take a look, at least in the chapter where she says that one isn't born a woman, that one becomes one. So the Second Sex, that's the re-release, and it's a complete edition. The Second Sex that we all looked at, you know, was this edition, The Second Sex, de Beauvoir, the classic manifesto of the liberated woman. 1949 in French, 1953 in English. And what Butler is saying there is really important, actually, that you're not born a woman, you become one. That really, you become one as, and she's an existentialist. And she's also, she and Sartre were partners for years, and friends for life. So, I mean, they both define the existential movement. But one is not born a woman, one becomes one through practice and experience. That is, gender is a relation and relational. That we develop how we do gender in relation to who we're interacting with. So, you know, it's a really good idea to interact with somebody who, who reinforces. It's like recognition, how you're doing gender. Like if you're interacting with somebody who's like, no, you're not doing, and wants to make changes, chances are what they're trying to do is feed back to you how to do gender. So de Beauvoir argued that the female gender is marked. It's a marked category. Whereas male gender is taken as the universal. Now you can see this in most of the political theory texts we're looking at. That what's taken as the universal subject is male gender. The male gender is seen as being universal and that it's conflated with person. And Butler also, de Beauvoir, who lived a long time, 1908 to 86, she says other really important things. I would say most important is one is not born a woman, but becomes one. Every female human being is not necessarily a woman. And that she questions, like, what is woman? She wonders if women will still exist, if they'll always exist, or they'll just be a person category. And then she says the battle of the sexes is not implicit in the anatomy of a man or a woman. So she's kind of a precursor to what Butler's going to do with it. Which then gets you to Irigaray. Now Lucy Irigaray is still alive. I've been at conferences on Irigaray and I've interacted with Irigaray through Skype. These two books, she has many others, Speculum of the Other Woman and The Sex Which Is Not One. Irigaray was born in 1930, she's quite old now. One of her key phrases that Butler picks up is that women are the sex which is not one. And by that she's doing a double play. That they don't exist as a sex, because they're the marked sex, and the female sex organ is multiple. She argues that because language is phallocentric, the role of the father, that women then constitute the unrepresentable. She's Lacanian, so she's influenced by that, but she doesn't see the female as a left. What she does see is that women enter language on masculine terms. So for the Lacanian, when you're born into language because you enter it on masculine terms. She then looks at Michel Foucault. Now, 1978, the first volume of The History of Sexuality, which then gets re-released. Foucault died in 84. He died in Paris. He's an internationally known writer, internationally known theorist, activist. What he says, and Butler develops this, is that there's no truth of sex that isn't historically produced through regulatory practices. These practices and resistance to these practices produce identities. So Foucault did a lot of study on homosexuality, which I'll talk about in a second. What destabilizes the system and calls into question this is Butler. The key liberal humanist term of person is what Foucault and Butler identify as incoherent genders, or non-intelligible genders. Okay, incoherent genders, non-intelligible genders, are genders that are politicizing gender. So if you go then to page 23, and I've got it right here, but this is where Butler writes about it, and she quotes Foucault here, that intelligible genders are those which in some sense institute and maintain coherence and continuity among sex, gender, sexual practices, and desire. Certain kinds of gender identities don't conform to this, right? So certain kinds of gender identities fail to conform to the norms of cultural intelligibility. They appear as developmental failures, and they're usually persecuted. Less so now, depending where you are in the world. But they appear as developmental failures or logical impossibilities from the dominant intelligibility. So for anybody in the room in addition to myself, who've had people over the years ask if I was male or female, which I thought was really delighted by. I was like, okay, I must be doing something good. But that's because you can see how somebody would be really upset if they weren't doing a non-intelligibility of gender, right? So this intelligible gender are those in which some sense that everything matches up, okay? Everything matches up, and there's a conformity. The persistence and proliferation, however, provides critical opportunities to expose the limits and regulatory aims of that domain of intelligibility. So if you take a look at the image here, one of the things that started happening in drag, for example, is half drag. Because half drag, if you're passing, it doesn't really, if you're passing and nobody knows that you're passing, because they're just taking you as whatever gender you're presenting, it doesn't really trouble or problematize the intelligibility of gender. But if you're right on the cusp there, you can kind of see how, depending on how one is performing gender, one could be male or female, same body, and it really messes with the intelligibility of gender. So if you go to page 23, because I think it's worth taking a look at this quote in like full, and I'll have to speed up because I want to make sure we get done by 1. We've got 4 people presenting, but if you go to 23, the second last paragraph, intelligible genders are those which in some sense institute and maintain relations of coherence. So you know when you're going to work, you tend to, depending on what your job is, you tend to present an intelligibility of gender, a coherence. So you know it's really interesting when you see somebody going to a professional job and then you see them when they're not at the professional job, their intelligibility of gender markers is much less so in many cases. So intelligibility of gender are those which in some sense institute and maintain relations of coherence and continuity among sex, gender, sexual practices, desire. In other words, the specters of discontinuity and incoherence themselves, thinkable only in relation to existing norms of continuity and coherence, are constantly prohibited and produced by the very laws that seek to establish causal or expressive lines of connection among biological sex, culturally constituted genders, and the expression or effect of both in the manifestation of sexual desire through sexual practice. Butler writes very complex. I would say that's a really, really important analysis in there that really sort of links the forced coherence and also the persecution that people that don't fall into forced coherence. Now Wittig is writing about, and Butler goes to Wittig. Foucault, okay, just to go back to Foucault for a second. We'll go back to Foucault because I want to link this with, Foucault. That is, for Foucault, sex is produced in discourse. That is, it's produced in the medical legal discourse. The best example that he studies is homosexuality. So a sexual activity, which is like sexual activity between two men, has always occurred, obviously. But it wasn't until the 1880s that the sexual activity is codified as homosexual in British law, and people are arrested as homosexuals. And that the person practicing these acts, which they were practicing in 1860, but the people practicing these acts after British law came in were given the identity of homosexual. So for my PhD thesis was on, it's called Reading, Writing, and Rewriting the Prostitute Body, Ancient Greece to Postmodern Performance Art. And one of the chapters in there takes a look at the making of the modern prostitute body, which was constructed as what constitutes a prostitute body in the 1880s when the homosexual were constructed. And one of the links between, particularly for women, is women who are on the street. So there's always this link, like on the street, like out in the public. So there's always this link between working class women and prostitution. And of course, when it first started, if somebody claimed you were a prostitute, you would get called in and tested. And of course, when you got tested, you were tested by unclean equipment. So they're testing you for diseases, right? They also had, there was just like, the studies of the production of the modern prostitute body are truly ridiculous, Okay, one study that came out in Russia, there was two studies that were completely ridiculous. The Russian study was measuring women's physiogamy of women's heads. So if you had a squarer jaw, you were more apt to be prostitute. It was like really bizarre. You're like, okay, I was like, okay, got it. And the other one that was also just the one in France was just like so wrong. The guy who studied the sewer systems then was the person in charge of studying prostitution. So he took these sewer metaphors that he used for the sewer systems and carried them into like descriptions of prostitution that fed into law. So that I found that fascinating. I was just like, oh, this is like so typical. And in the 1880s are really interesting to see how those who don't fit the dominant mode are codified in law. Now, interestingly, lesbians are not codified in law. Okay, homosexuals were, but lesbians weren't. Which takes us. I mean, I'm going to make a segue to Wittig here, because what Wittig is doing is she's contending that the category of sex itself, the term sex, is always feminine in systems of compulsory heterosexuality. And compulsory heterosexuality is like you don't have a choice, right? Men are persons and gender is feminine, and that's on page 19 to 20. So she's saying anytime you talk about gender, it's seen, and sex, it's seen as feminine. That is, what exists is a binary system. And what Butler is Wittig is critiquing as is Butler. That clock's wrong, right? It's an hour ahead. We're only at like about 1:45.
Yeah.
Good. I was like, what? So then that in this system, the effect, that is sex, is taken as the cause of gender, which gets Butler to talk about the discourse of the metaphysics of substance. Once you say that this is gender, you're dealing with the metaphysics of substance. And I think if you go to page 25, 25, she's saying central to each of these four views she's looking at, it's the last paragraph at the beginning of it, is the notion that sex appears within hegemonic language as substance, as metaphysically speaking, as a self-identical being. And she says, no, this is just this metaphysics of substance, that gender and sex is not there as a substance. It's given a substance in discourse. Which allows her then, it takes her to Nietzsche's claim that, and this is in the Genealogy of Morals, and it's on page 33. Now this was one of the biggest radical claims when the book came out. But and it's Nietzsche because she takes Nietzsche on the self and relates it to gender. So she says there's no being, okay, this is Nietzsche, page 33. It's great, you can do lots with this. But there's no being behind doing, affecting, becoming. The doer is merely a fiction added to the deed. The deed is everything. That is, the doing of gender is everything. So Butler takes what Nietzsche says, and she says there's no gender identity behind the expression of gender. That identity is performatively, so that identity is performatively constituted by the expressions of it that are said to be the result. So you can see how it's circular. That the gender is actually constituted performatively by the expressions that are seen to be its result. That we're creating gender all the time, and then people are saying, laws are saying, and popular culture is saying, this is gender. And Butler says, no, there's no gender identity behind our expression of it. That the identity is performatively constituted by the very expressions that are said to be its results. That's page 34. So then, what is gender for Butler? Okay. Well, it's non-binary. It is not a noun, and that just comes after page 25, where she outlines that it's not a noun. After she talks about the metaphysics of substance on page 27, then she goes on to say, okay, what's gender? It's not a noun. It's the substantive effect, she says, the substantive effect of gender is performatively produced. It's a doing. It's an apparatus, really, gender is an apparatus of production. And then if you take a look at fourth way feminist here, see, I always felt gender was an optional thing you could participate in. However, if you wanted, it felt like a daily performance part. And I would add to that, yes, for those of us that are privileged, that gender can be seen as an optional thing you could participate in, and that you can do it as a daily performance. But for those of us, that doesn't take away that the incoherent genders, the genders that don't fit, are persecuted and beat up and killed for not fitting. And I think that's really important. So if you've got the luxury, as many of us in the room do, of playing with gender, and in my case playing with it and writing about it, it is a luxury, okay? You're not, yes, I came close to being beat up, for being a gay man walking, 3 o'clock in the morning, going home in Kensington Market, because I was wearing all leather and I had a shaved head. But Anna winked out because when they got at the car, started yelling the usual homophobic slurs, pulled over, and they were going to get out, and I was like, hey guys, I'm a girl. And I think today I still regret saying that, right? Because I was like, I don't want to be beat up. And the thing was, they didn't actually, it was again, 90s, they didn't actually turn that into, oh my God, you don't fit as a girl. They were like, oh, I'm sorry. And I was like, okay. I was like, and then I did say, well, you shouldn't be beating me up if I'm a guy, and then I did say that, and they're like, okay, and I'm thinking, well, I gotta get out of here because how long will it take me to figure out I'm not fitting as a girl, right? So I was like, so yeah, but just imagine how many people still, and that was a while ago, but still get beat up for not fitting all the time in Toronto, in the gay village, on the subway, people get beat up all the time. It's like a real privilege to be able to play with gender, and I think that has to be underlined. And you can say it's a, I don't know, you can say it's a class privilege, so then on page 10, I want to go back to page 10 for Butler. When the constructed status of gender is theorized as radically independent of sex, gender becomes this free-floating artifice, she says, with the consequences that man and masculinity might just as easily signify a female body as a male one. If you go back to the image we had before and woman and feminine, a male body as easily as a female body. So if you go back here, you can kind of see that playing out here. It can signify a male body or a female body. The markers of masculinity and femininity. So I said this before, but I think it's really important to get Butler's words here. That gender is the repeated stylization of the body. It's a set of repeated acts that rigify within time, a highly regulated frame that congeal over time, to produce the appearance of substance. And she's saying it's a metaphysics of substance. They produce the appearance of substance, but it's not a substance of a natural sort of being. So she says, gender is the repeated stylization of the body, a set of repeated acts within a highly regulatory frame that congeal over time to produce the appearance of substance of a natural sort of being, but it's not natural. That it's produced over time. The mistake we make is to think that we inscribe from birth cultural inscriptions on how to act, what to do, who to love, onto the anatomical sex body. But gender, and now this is where this could link up very well, I would say, with the readings on Marx. Gender is an apparatus of production. It produces cultural artifice and sex of the body. That is, gender, you know how Spinoza says, and it gets picked up, it's just repeated, nobody knows what a body can do. And he's referring to like celestial bodies and a human and a physical body. What Butler is saying is that gender has determined what a body can do. But if you dislink gender and the body, a body can do many different things. So one of the great things about the film Harriet is often when she's helping people escape, because she escaped and she's a free person and she's going back helping them, she goes back as Moses. because Moses set my people free. She goes back as a man. And so they're constantly looking for a man, and she passes very, very well. And she also ends up training soldiers in the war as like, I mean, she's using a female presence there, but it's like she really shows, the reason the movie is so fantastic, she really shows that in dire situations, gender is not, it doesn't really matter. It's like what you can do, what a body can do. The rest is just taken on as sort of cultural baggage and artifacts, right? Or artifacts. So what Butler then says is there's no gender identity behind the expressions of gender. That identity is constituted by the very expressions that are said to be its result. And that is on page 33. And you've seen that twice. Now, I'm going to go to about 5 after, but no more. So I want to go down to this. Because one of the things that becomes interesting is that Butler writes about is that when you replicate heterosexual constructs in non-heterosexual frames, you start seeing them as constructed. And then you start seeing the construction of the so-called heterosexual or original. And then when you ask people, like I spent a lot of time asking, people that were doing hyper-masculine performativity, including the elite, what's it called, G4 or something, maybe it's not G4, but it's F4, the elite force that guards the prime minister. I was in Bosnia, and their job, and they were not thrilled with this, was to guard us academics, right? And they're just like, but I was talking to them about gender, because obviously they were doing a hyper-masculinizing, including the woman that was there, that was part of the force, it was 4 of them. And they had it was really odd, they had no conception of performing gender. Like, they were like, man, I'm just doing my job, and like I have no idea what you're talking about. So they knew I was there as a feminist theorist, I was thinking, so they were okay with talking with me about it, but they had no conception that what they were doing was utterly constructed. You become aware that it's utterly constructed when it's done on a body that is not part of the heterosexual framework. So gay is to straight, Butler says, not as a copy to an original, but as a copy of a copy. That we think, dominant culture will think that what's being presented as straight, as heterosexual, is like the foundation, but it's also just a copy. The parodic repetition of the original reveals the original to be nothing other than a parody of an idea of the natural and original. And that's on page 41. So let me see if I can jump ahead. I think that's important. I want to do slide 23, but I also want to take you to what this means. I want to take you to 2 other things. Okay. That this means there's no ontology of gender. There's no reality of gender. That gender is an effect. That being a man or a woman is an effect. It's the marking of power relations on the body. That it's an effect that's performatively produced. And then, building on Foucault, and this is on page 40, that is, if sexuality is constructed culturally within existing power relations, then the idea, the postulation of a normative sexuality that is outside, beyond power, is culturally impossible. So she says, okay, de Beauvoir kind of suggests there's an essence that doesn't go very far. Organise says there's something sort of foundational that makes you female. Foucault totally debunks this. This is actually Foucault rephrased by Butler. And Wittig says that the female body does have a particular, that she has an essence as well in it. So basically, Butler's influenced by these 4, but she's most influenced by Foucault and de Beauvoir. Now, I want to talk about recognition, and because it's not in the section you read, it's 2 pages over. So she, and you can use this in the essay if you want. So Butler has a particular understanding of recognition coming out of both Hegel, the section you read on consciousness and self-consciousness, and out of Lacan and the gaze. And she says she sees recognition as becoming. That is, when we recognize another or we ask for recognition ourselves, we're not asking for the other to see us as we are. We already are, as we've always been, as we were constituted prior to the encounter. Rather, the encounter itself is a process of becoming something new. To ask for recognition or to offer it is precisely not to ask for recognition for what one already is. It is to solicit a becoming, to instigate a transformation, to petition the future always in relation to the other. So she takes recognition and she extends it as to what you're becoming, not what you are at the point of contact. I will go over these next week, but I want to put them up there, because next week will fit well too. Butler gets us to what I think are really important questions in doing political theory, and really important gender questions. That is, any thinker you're reading, it's a good idea to ask yourself, what does that thinker say about gender? And if you get nothing, which is often the case, particularly in the 19th, 18th, and 20th century, not all of them, then you have to kind of dig and say, okay, well, what does he say not directly, but what is some of the intelligibility that's there in the text that leads you to figure out what he says? Does their position on gender equality and rights reflect the position of women in their society at that time? Are they simply just mimicking it? Or does it lag behind? Are they hearkening back to a previous time? A time before the more radical one they're living in? Does it critique the unequal gender position that exists? Or does it simply perpetuate it by doing nothing? And does the thinker just ignore gender? Is gender absent in the text? And then the question really becomes, if it's absent in the text and the thinker ignores gender, what does it mean to ignore gender? So then you ask yourself, like, what does it mean? And I think this is, because I read a lot of texts that were not written for me. What does it mean then for the reader to be somebody the text isn't written for? Right? So what does it mean for a reader who's not supposed to be reading the text to read the text? Because that gives you a completely different meaning. We'll talk about that in Said. I didn't think of that concept, but I always try, I think it was it Rancière that posed that? It's been posed a number of times by different people, but it's like, you know, you take a look at certain novels are written for certain readers. What does it mean when somebody who can't read, Rancière did post this, when somebody who can't read reads the text and it was not written for them, they were excluded from it, okay? So I mean, I think he talks about that in his book, Read Speech. So I think that's a really important question, like, okay, what does it mean when we're reading these texts that were not necessarily written for us, we're not exactly the reader they're addressed to, then what does it mean? Like when we read them, and Spivak's going to do some really great stuff on this, then when we read them, we get a completely different meaning of it. We also get angry, okay? Sometimes you're just reading a text and you're like, you know. Okay, let's stop there. Let's be back at 20 after, and we got 4 people.